Jack, are you there?" A man, apparently Jack, was standing out in the middle of a familiar-looking graveyard. With a hand up to his ear, he stood staring at the camera. Finally, he spoke. "Okay, Tom. We have you now. I just arrived here a few moments ago. I've been told that we have an incident up on the hill over there. I'll turn this over to Tom Burles, who is at the grave site now. Tom, I'm transferring you up there." The scene changed, and they were under some trees. A shorter man was standing there, again holding his ear with his hand. Finally, this man spoke into the microphone. "This is Tom Burles in the Peaceful Valley Cemetery out on Old 36. Today at noon we received an anonymous telephone call. The caller was never identified by name, but we have here something rather gruesome. It is a grave, as you can see, that has been robbed of its corpse. There was a casket here earlier, and we can see that whoever this person was—" A close-up on the gravestone made Frangi's heart quiver. It said the words he had hoped that it would not say. "The Charlotte dance is gone as well. With me is Deputy Graylick with the Montgomery Sheriff's Office. Deputy Graylick is with the Vice Bureau, and that bureau, sir, if I understood you correctly, deals with this sort of thing." The man, a large plainclothes detective, stepped up to the mic with a very serious look on his face. "That is correct," he said, staring over the correspondent's head. "Our division handles primarily what is referred to in archaic jargon as crimes of vice. This once referred to things like gambling and prostitution, sexual crimes." "And this is a sexual crime, Deputy?" asked Burles. "What we have here?" "We tend to treat this as a form of necrophilia until we know for sure that another statute is required. You never know anymore, but the only two motivations that an individual could have based on our experiences is monetary gain or just plain old love of the dead." "And what exactly is necrophilia, sir, for our viewing audience?" asked Burles. The deputy looked at him again with a serious stare. "It's a sick perversion," said Deputy Graylick. "It involves an unnatural attachment for the dead, a sexual fetish that urges the actor to commit a sexual act with the deceased corpse." That was pretty plainly spelled out, thought Frangi, as he listened to the program. "I see," said Burles, hiding his reaction. "And when do you think you'll know whether or not this is what you have?" "We won't know anything," said Graylick, "until a body pops up somewhere. A body is a very difficult thing to conceal, and once it's in the open air for a few days, it begins to soften a good deal, even embalmed. Somebody'll smell a wild odor, and we'll get a call. We'll get it back unless the person who did this buries the body again." "And how long has this one been out, do you think?" That's hard to say with this stone. I guess about a month or more. I'm not telling you anything for sure. I guess that, but it could have happened a week ago for all I know. I'll have to get a tech out here and see if the person touched the stone. Fingerprints would be really helpful in this case. It's about all we have at this time." The correspondent nodded as seriously as the deputy had done. "Thank you, Deputy Graylick," said the correspondent. "Well, as you have been able to gather from all this, we have either a necrophiliac out here or a ghoul of some kind. We have made a few inquiries of our own. Channel 8 has learned that this particular body is out here in this graveyard without a county permit to be here. The county government's been out here all day, and to date they have found a number of stones that do not correspond to any of their previous plot charts. Now, this doesn't mean that they don't belong here, because there are 5 sets of these charts on file with the county. They've been a little slow to correlate their paperwork, it seems. A mix-up might have occurred, but we won't know now. What this does mean is that the people who have buried these bodies out here have not paid the proper fees to the county for burial. Now, this is a felony under the improper disposal of a dead body statute, and the crime is a second-class felony, punishable by up to 50 years in the state prison system upon a conviction. We will be keeping you informed, Channel 8, so that you'll be the very first to know where the real stories are. Back to you, Jack. Donnie clicked the set-off and sat back in his chair. He was still as white as a ghost, and Frangi was getting worried about him all over again. "She's done took her, ain't she?" asked Donnie, lapsing back into his bad speech habits that he brought up with him from Daytona. He always lapsed like that when he was upset. "I don't know for sure," said Frangi, "but it does seem likely, doesn't it?" "She didn't tell us that she found her," said Donnie distantly. "She wasn't going to tell us anything. She knew what she was going to do all along. She didn't tell us a thing. Didn't want us to know about it." "Hell, man," said Frangie, taking up for her. "She's grief-stricken, like I'm going to be in a few weeks. I'd have similar thoughts myself." Donnie looked at him in horror. "Don't look at me like that," said Frangie. "I won't have it. It's the very same look that your brother gave to you when he found out we liked each other. It's a judgmental look, Donnie, and it doesn't become you." "You dig me up, Fran?" asked Donnie, his eyes wide. Frangie shook his head violently. "No, man," he said. "You haven't been listening to me, have you? I said if I had Rachel's situation, I might have done the same thing. She found Charlotte, I am sure, the night we found her." "In the cemetery?" Donnie nodded. He had thought so, too. "Well, she didn't know who had buried her daughter up there, or even if it was her daughter at all. You heard the telecaster, didn't you? He said that the plot wasn't paid for. He said that someone has been putting people into the ground in the Peaceful Valley Cemetery for nothing." "Yeah, and that's a crime," said Donnie. "But, Fran, damn it, it's also a crime to do what she did." "I refuse to judge my friends before they've been charged and convicted," yelled Frangie, getting angry. "Now I'm going over to her house, and—" "You can't go, Fran," said Donnie. "Man, she's crazy. You don't know what she might do." "You don't listen to a friggin' thing I say, do you?" shrieked Frangie. "I'm at my wit's end, I swear, and you try me. And for what? Because you won't listen." Donnie looked away, his feelings hurt. Being the younger man, he always did feel like Frangie lorded his age over him a little bit too much. His eyes misted a bit as Frangie continued to stare at him. "Go," said Donnie quietly. "Just go." Frangie turned around and went to get his coat. Donnie sat there. Frangie always was such a lousy judge of character, wasn't he? You really shouldn't fight with him, he told himself. You don't have that much time to fight now. You should get really mellow and just sort of like drift into this death thing. Just mellow the hell out. Frangie left the house without conferring further with Donnie. Donnie decided that the reason he was edgy was because he had not had a Valium this morning. He needed one badly. He got up to go and get himself one. As he passed by the living room, he could see the Fiero 2 on its way up the road to the Abbey. As he watched after his friend, suddenly he felt a bit of fear, real fear, go through him. What if she was up there over top of that body? What if she had an axe or something and was waiting for him to come inside so she could put it right through his thick, stupid head? What if he was right and she did all of these things? Donnie went to get his medicine, his mind consciously trying to drive away the fear welling up inside of him. He got into the bathroom and opened the mirrored cabinet as a razor fell out and clattered into the sink. As he watched the razor leap out of the cabinet, jumping at him, he screamed. The scream startled him worse than the falling razor had done. The echo of the tiles made his hollow, drum-like head ache. He closed the cabinet and looked at himself in the mirror. An awful thought came to him. I'll never be handsome again. He stared at his withered reflection, his drawn and haggard expression in the glass. He did look like death warmed over. He swallowed his Valium dry and then gulped a slurp or two of tap water to wash it down. He looked at himself once more to determine his appearance, and then he went to his own room, to his own bed. He walked over and stripped his clothes off, falling into bed. The drug would make him sleep, and right now he wanted that more than he wanted to live. Dr. Brimmer sat later that same day in front of his television. He had been shocked to see the report they had done at the cemetery. It was quite spooky to see it, but his boys had taken care of things properly for a change. The idea of what Rachel had done did not shock him at all. He had always thought Rachel had it in her. So why not see if he was able to push her over the edge? He might get a fine assistant out of her, in case she ever got out of prison for grave robbing. They'd probably hospitalize her for this crime, Thorazine her up really tight. That'd convince her of her worthlessness. On that shit, she'd feel worthless. He smiled to himself. It would be so easy to tell the cops something about Rachel, but by this time, Charlotte would be so decayed that anyone could find her. Shame, actually. He could have saved the kid if Rachel had just left things alone. But that was not in Rachel's nature, was it, to leave things alone? No, of course not. She was a woman, and women can't leave anything alone. They're possessed or something. They have to go in and screw with things, like children. Kids always have to be screwing up something to satiate that unflagging curiosity. Women were just like kids. It was crazy. How would Rachel feel to know that it was her fault that Charlotte was now dead? How would that make her feel? Would it make her feel like not ever shaving her legs again and coming to bed with him as his personal slut? Would it make her want to be defiled and ravaged out of an undying guilt? Possibly. Bremer smiled. It was almost criminal what he had done. And as a criminal, it should be a fair trial that he would get for his crimes, shouldn't it be? Fine. Give him a really fair trial, and he'd turn himself into the authorities for arrest. But he'd never expect a conviction. Let the record show that I had plans to put one Charlotte Renee Dance into a state of cryogenic suspension until such time as I saw fit to resurrect her. Let the record show also that I did not mean for Rachel to discover the whereabouts of the body. I submit before this court of law that I, Thaddeus P. Bremer, Ph.D., and technical director of the cryogenic oxygenation deep sleep program at County General Hospital, am innocent by virtue of the need to know. It is an illness, and one which I have used to great personal advantage as well as tremendous public gain. I hereby submit those of my techniques that are in use today because of my eccentricity. As witnesses, I reserve the right to subpoena all of my former patients who have benefited from my vast knowledge on the reattachment of severed limbs and the surgical perfection of their routine incisions. I mourn the passing of Charlotte Dance because I could have saved her. Not guilty. Of course not. How could he be guilty? He didn't kill anyone. Rachel Blackwelder had killed her. Sure, one could say that Dr. Bremer could have left well enough alone in the first place, and Charlotte would still be with us. But what price knowledge? Who is willing to go up on Sinai and get those tablets of stone from God himself? Who has the testicular fortitude to make the climb and converse with burning bushes? Who among us is Abraham? Who is Abraham enough to sacrifice an Isaac to the altar of fire, or in this case, ice? And for what? For knowledge, for wisdom, for strength, for wealth, for all of the things a vengeful God may give and does give as gifts to his own elect. Yes, for the people who will be saved literally in the name of Charlotte Dance. She will literally be the mother of them all. She had been, after all, one of his cryox deep sleep patients, had she not? And had she not given her life for his project? Was she not a martyr in the classical sense? Of course she was. And in closing, I must conclude that it was Rachel Christine McPherson Blackwelder who slew this poor child, Charlotte Renee Dance, late of the Natchitoches Parish, Louisiana. Counsel will prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Miss Blackwelder sought to tempt this physician in ways he could not control, and did then and there give him to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, ergo the knowledge of Charlotte's existence. With that secret knowledge came the burning desire to have her, firstly, out of my way. This would free Rachel to accept my advances. This would make her lonely enough to want outside company. None of these things are crimes. Secondly, this would also give me the patient that I required, for who better than a missing person to make missing? Who better than a runaway to run away with? Dare anyone so afflicted say he could have resisted unto the death of his dreams, both professional and personal? Would the gods have given to me the power to realize all that could be mine, clearing all the obstacles from my way, so that I might know perfection, not only in this one child, but in her surrogated mother? And could we not have had her resurrected unto life once again, as a productive member of our society, if only Rachel had not disturbed her frozen remains? Who dares accuse me of mischief then? He who can raise the dead. Speak, for I am waiting. Rachel tempted me to take the child as well as her own fleshly body. I am a mere mortal with drives they will never understand. I am a slave to my sex, to the heroine in my loins. I am a man of passions. I am a man of means, and I can do things that others would find fantastic. I have a God-given responsibility not to hide the talent of the Almighty, lest in time He come and demand it of me with usury. I am His special creature, His one talented physician. Will I not work what miracles He has given me to work? With my talents I have become wealthy. All men of the Bible were wealthy. Solomon, Abraham, they all had a talent for attracting wealth. I am wealthy as a sign of my good works. Rachel is a woman, and as such she must suffer the curse of her kind. In a downfall of female flesh, I find myself drowning with desire, filthy desires. I lusted for Charlotte for my work, and Rachel for my play. Would not any harem caliph or courtyard king been out of the way to demand the same of his bride and her handmaiden? Will you, the jury, not decide that it was Rachel who has slain Charlotte, who has taken her before her time? The defense rests. Dr. Bremer sat back, waiting for the jury to unanimously find him innocent on all charges. He watched television, and he drank scotch while all deliberated a verdict. He slept lightly and drowsed from the alcohol he had ingested while they met with the foreman of the grand jury in his mind and found him to be not guilty. He smiled sweetly in his sleep, his mind free at last of all traces of remorse, of any guilt at all, over the death of Charlotte Dance. Chapter 15. When Frangi arrived at the Abbey, it was nearly evening. The sun was going down early tonight, in part because of the shortening of the days, but also because of the nasty cumulonimbus cloud formations in the western skies. If the sun came out from behind that at all, it would be just a brief flash. Just what he needed. Darkness. It would be bad enough to find Rachel in the daytime after what she had done. To see her like the other night would be more than he wanted to deal with. Donnie wasn't along for comfort this time, and as he placed his card into the slot to open the great iron gates that read The Abbey, he trembled. He had never before been scared to visit Rachel's Abbey. This fear had an unnaturalness to it, like suddenly being afraid of your own mother. There was only one disease in the world that could cause such a fear of known and respected loved ones. That disease was insanity. That disease specialized in alienating loved ones and family members from each other, whether it was in the form of senility or that new thing with teenagers, that ADS, adolescent depression syndrome. All of it was still insanity. All of it hurt like hell. The gates actually creaked as they swung open tonight. He looked up at the great geometric parapets upon which compromised the roof. The Abbey looked too much like Dracula's Castle Carfax tonight to suit Frangi. He was not alone. Something was with him. He just couldn't tell what it was. He was not one for horror anyway. Not like Rachel, who loved to get the shit scared out of her every once in a while. Until now, Frangi had always thought that she was just indulging a passion with her horror, like he did with his homosexuality. He had always just assumed that she was just as open-minded and just as liberal as he was, just that she enjoyed the bizarre. He never thought that she would do anything bizarre herself. Poor Rachel. Charlotte was a member of their family until she died, but she was now a member of the dead, and Rachel would have to learn this. Charlotte was gone, and no amount of crying and kissing that cold little forehead would ever bring her back to life. Now he must save Rachel from herself. He drove up the driveway and stopped just shy of that bit of yellow paint Rachel had sprayed to show him where to stop, so he would not open the garage door. He stared up at the great picture window glass, wanting very much to see a small hand come to the side of the curtain to wave to him. The glass was an opaque shield this evening, reflecting the black indigo of the distant clouds. He could make out no shape in the glass save the western skies. The place was haunted by storm clouds, if nothing else. He turned up the collar on his jacket and rolled the window up in his Fiero. It would rain this evening, he was sure of it. It would be a night for storms. He walked up the sidewalk, not clacking boots tonight. He had worn his only pair of tennis shoes, a pair of Reebok Nike Variance Pros. The shoes had not been out of the box until tonight, and he had not had them on since he had been fitted. Now the new shoes felt like something a spaceman would wear, with their high-top ankle wraps and their tiger paw suspension system, guaranteed to never turn an ankle. They were the most comfortable shoes he had ever worn. They were also $200 a pair. He was at the door before he saw that no one was home. He didn't see a light on inside as he peered through the side door. He got his key out of his pocket and placed it in the doorknob. The key opened the door as it had always done, and he went into the sealed house. The air pushed past him as if it were in a hurry to get out of the closed container of the interior. Its smell was old and a little bit soured. Everything in the kitchen was dark. The water in the whirlpool was all drained dry. It had been dry for days. No one was home. Frangi felt the hair rise on the back of his neck as he looked down onto the floor. He saw what only could have been cemetery soil scattered all over the floor of the kitchen. It was tracked into the linoleum, and it was ground into the shag carpet. Dirt from the cemetery that Rachel had tracked into her own house so carelessly. She would have never done that before. He followed the dirt into Rachel's bedroom, where he saw the cause of it. Crumpled there on the floor by the bed was a large black tarpaulin. It was the thing she must have used to drag Charlotte out of the ground. Of course it was. What nurse has not been shown how to drag a lifeless body in a sheet sled? Must have been a powerfully tiresome drag, he thought, even to the back of a Mustang. He saw the bed was empty. He looked all around the closet and in the various nooks and crannies just to be sure. He found no dead Charlotte and no trace of Rachel. He looked in Charlotte's room, and it appeared that the bed had not been slept in for months. She must have really been sleeping with Rachel. He never really wanted to think of Rachel and Charlotte as being lovers, in the sense that he and Donnie were. It just didn't seem natural to him. They were too much like mother and daughter for that. Their love was a sweet greeting card kind of love. Wasn't it? Something was terribly wrong in here, and he didn't yet know what it was. It was like one of those houses the police go into after a crime has been committed, where all of the belongings are scattered everywhere, and the contraband is either destroyed or disappeared with the criminals. Contraband like the body of one Charlotte Renee Dance. Contraband in the form of a small corpse, dearly beloved and dearly missed, but grave-robbed nonetheless. It was a terribly hideous crime that Rachel had committed. He was trying to justify her actions, but every time he got close to thinking about what she had done, a strange coldness came over him, a coldness that he knew would separate them. He would not be able to trust her now. Now she was a stranger to him. Donnie was right. Frangi was on his high and mighty horse today. Francis Angelino, the man to cast that first stone. After all, he wasn't the one about to die of AIDS. He wasn't the one who had desecrated a grave, the grave of a dear and beloved friend. The life was gone from Charlotte, and a crazed Rachel Blackwelder had snatched her body, but it was Frangi who stood in absolute judgment today, wasn't it? Oh, he was without sin. A little bit sweet sometimes, but so what? He closed his eyes and tried to repent. He tried to stop thinking of Rachel as an animal. He came here, damn it, to help her, not to pass judgment on her. She must have had a good reason for what she'd done. A better reason than just grief. A much better reason. But she was not here to help in her own defense. He looked around again and started to leave. There was no more to be done here. In fact, there was nothing here. He saw where she had taken a lot of her stuff. Her closet was empty of her clothes, except for a bizarre assortment of underthings, and the place was otherwise empty. He did not venture behind the Japanese screen at the rear of the closet, and so he never found the masks. If he had done so, he would have found the middle hook where had once hung a beautiful black and indigo feathered affair, the one that Charlotte had loved so much, the one that Rachel had taken with which to cremate Charlotte. This mask and the gray and black zebra robe were both missing. Rachel had taken them both, but Franji did not know that. Franji did make a brief inspection in the basement, but only long enough to ascertain that no one was down there. He got out as quickly as he could. He didn't notice on his way out of the basement, but the gas cans were missing. So was one of a pair of picnic benches, along with 20 of the colored logs that she burned each Christmas. All he knew was that Rachel was not in the Abbey, and neither was Charlotte. As he came out of the house, sunset was fast approaching. He felt the urge to bolt, to run down the steps to his car before sunset could occur. It was as if Charlotte was now a vampire, secreted away somewhere in the house, waiting for darkness. It was an awful feeling, but it would have been Rachel's thing, for sure. She would have loved to see a movie along that theme, wouldn't she? Stop it, he told himself. That's not fair. But Franji was secretly terrified of women in general. He always made a close analogy between the vampire and the sexy woman everyone called the vamp. It made sense, didn't it? Women were, by nature, sensual and lusty creatures. They were creatures of the night spots and discos. Women were the incarnate lust of man to begin with, weren't they? A woman could do shit you'd never think she would, like this. As he walked to his car, he had a nightmarish feeling that he was being watched still. Watched as he left the Abbey. Abbey, huh? Good name for it. No men for sure in a den of women. Even Franji was still a man. He had never thought about that before now. The feelings of being watched remained inside of him, irritating his stomach and making him feel afraid. Fear and mounting unease made their way into his mind as he sat down at the front seat of his car. He looked up at the house but saw nothing in the dimming windows as night fell onto the property. He started his engine and whipped around in the driveway to leave the gates. The gates began to slowly crank open as he hit the place in the pavement that would allow him to leave. As he went out of those gates, the feeling of being watched subsided. It ended just as soon as he hit the old Welsh road. Rachel had crossed over into the bizarre and unnatural. She was at last as demented as her hobby had taught her to be. Rachel was a monster at last. As he drove on towards his own home, he tried to calm down. A feeling of remorse came over him. He would not make any final decision concerning Rachel until he had heard from her. But he would have to be ready to give up on her. He would have to face the fact that he was probably about to lose a very good and very dear friend. And as he thought this, he had a feeling again that, yes, he had been watched from the house. He had been seen at the Abbey. There had been eyes looking at him from the picture window as he had pulled out of the driveway. There had been eyes in those windows for sure, but they had not belonged to anything human. The eyes were the windows of the house itself. The house had seen him come and had seen him go. As he made it to the intersection of 36 and 276, a great electric shudder ran up his spine. In a small beach house along the Atlantic Ocean, a small light burned in the window, facing the beach. The house was the only thing here for miles around. The nearest residence, other than this, was 3 miles away. The closest grocery store was nearly 5. The place was deserted property. The house had no power, it had no water, and 3 of its largest windows were broken out. The air was cold and winter outside. Inside the house, a small kerosene heater burned nicely. The jugs of bottled water sat where they had been left, over by the door. There were 8 such bottles, each one holding 5 gallons of water. The gas stove was full of fuel, and a small meal had been cooked there just a short while ago. All over the kitchen area lay the remains of instant dinner wrappers. There was an unopened box of circus peanuts, just in case the little girl might want some later, if she woke up. The little girl had always loved circus peanuts. Along the outside porch, shielded from the elements, were 3 great cans of gasoline and several smaller ones. There was also kerosene containers and other types of fuel for the devices inside the house. The whole porch was stacked with survival fuels, in fact. From sterno to high-test 90-octane gasoline, the porch had everything imaginable in the way of combustible fuel. The holes in the 3 windows had been covered with boards, and the cracks had been sloppily caulked to keep the draft out. The place was extremely dark, except for the hurricane lamps and the small gas generator of uncertain manufacture, which had been found in the attic. From this generator an electric blanket was attached, as well as a small water heater and tub assembly. They were used for a makeshift bath. There was a chemical toilet over in the corner. It was rather like one of those glorified kitty litter boxes that packages the waste as it is introduced into the system. Stacked against the wall were supplies from County General Hospital that at one time had been intended to treat a coma victim named Roger Blackwelder. Rachel had one time gathered all of these supplies for him, but Roger died before he could put them to use. Now they would serve a different purpose. Rachel sat on the bed holding Charlotte's lifeless body in her arms. She was careful not to disturb the intravenous flow into the arm, nor the NG tube that ran down Charlotte's throat. She was careful not to do any of the things that might cause Charlotte any discomfort. She wanted her little girl to get better real soon. As Rachel held little Charlotte's freshly bathed body, she smiled down into her silent face. The girl lay peacefully where Rachel had bedded her down. The bed was nice and surprisingly clean. All she had had to do was beat the mattress, change the sheets, and put Charlotte to bed. It was working out pretty well now, if little Charlie would just wake up. They would come for her, she was sure. They always did have a way of finding people. They somehow just knew where to look. It would most likely be that son of a bitch Bremer who would figure out where she had taken the body. She wanted to kill him so bad she could taste it. How could he have done this to Charlotte? Tears of impotent rage would stream down her cheeks as she considered what Bremer had done. It was far worse than raping or even branding her. These things she had recovered from, but what Bremer had done to her was unforgivable. She never moved nor made a sound. Rachel would look at her until she would cry sometimes. Best not to think on that now, right, Charlotte? She would ask her friend. Best just to think happy thoughts, positive thoughts until you get well again. She had done the old Navajo life chant and everything. Nothing was coming back to her. Charlotte didn't seem to change at all from day to day. It had been a week now and still nothing. Rachel was beginning to get worried. The house was warm and the water was sterilized. The NG tube was still as good as ever, canned and packaged over on the table. She was feeding the girl a balanced diet and washing her daily. She was doing everything she could to make her well. All she needed was a little miracle. Poor Charlotte. Her eyes were black as burn holes in a blanket, sunken in like a corpse's eyes. Her face was slightly bloated, and her lips were thicker than they normally were. She looked like a china doll, all made up for a death festival. Rachel touched her cool arm and ran her finger down the soft skin, the same skin that had been as hard as a rock when she had exhumed her. She closed her eyes and tried to recall the exhumation. It had been too painful at first, but now as the time dragged by and the shock had worn off, she could recall what a time she had gone through trying to dig Charlotte's body out of the cemetery ground. She leaned back on the bed and recalled what that had been like. If anyone could have told Rachel Blackwelder what would have been waiting for her in the grave of Charlotte Dance, she would not have believed it. Rachel had left her house fully prepared to sacrifice Charlotte's corpse to the night skies. It was Halloween night, and the orange in the sunset had been simply gorgeous. She was not in the least grossed out for what she had been contemplating. It was a cleansing she was going to perform this evening on Charlotte, on herself. A cleansing by fire, a last will and request for Charlotte Dance. Charlotte, who had wanted a cremation, was going to get one. She did not want to be buried, and by thunder, she didn't have to be either. The Indians would have demanded she be exhumed for a funeral pyre burial. A custom of the old generation required burning to release the soul to the happy hunting ground. That was what burning was for, to release the soul from the body, to set the spirits free. Fine night for that, All Hallows' Eve. How could something like an evening for saints have become a festival for witches? She wondered that. Perhaps originally the demons had been fleeing from the night in the subsequent All Saints' Day of November 1st. Well, she wasn't going to see any witches out here tonight. There was not any sign of life out here at all. Just her. The bonfire for Charlotte would be a private matter, and only she would be invited. Out here at night, no one would see anything. Even the monorails would be too far away to catch a glimpse of the intense flames she had in mind for Charlotte's remains. She thought of Isaac and Abraham. Would to God that she had a ram caught in a thicket to burn, rather than her own special friend. Would to God she could be allowed to take Charlotte home again, as a living, breathing soul. Roger had believed in the Navajo way, but Rachel could see the Christian God secreted within the Indian faith mechanisms. How the soul dance of they twain becoming one flesh worked. That was how it all worked, wasn't it? Faith, the substances of things hoped for, the evidences of things not seen. She had, placed in the back of the Mustang, an altar consisting of one picnic bench. She'd had 5 gallons of gasoline in different containers, and she'd had a lot of those colored logs they used to burn at Christmas time. 3 lighters from Roger's old private chest in the attic. He used to smoke a pipe and had lots of lighters. These had not been struck in several years, but all still did the trick when she tested the flints in each one of them. She had fire. The fire itself, Roger had told her, must be as hot as blue Hades. The flames have to be sufficient to totally cook the bones to the point of crumbling. After the fire is extinguished, there must be nothing of the Indian left. All major bones have to be ash after such a burial. To ensure this, hot coals and pine tree resin was often used to finish the job. We today would use gasoline most likely, or else a flammable petrol-based solution. The idea of a closed-room cremation would have been detestable to the old Navajo, Rachel, he had told her. A closed fire would have burnt the spirit they were trying to release into the air. Fine then, Charlotte gets a Navajo cremation. Open air and all. Terrific. Now if she could only get up enough nerve to actually do it. This thought she had not entertained at all. She had just blindly plunged ahead with her cremation plans. To think of cremating Charlotte helped her to be less grief-stricken. She didn't know how, but it worked. She had actually felt better when she began planning her friend's cremation on the open fire out in the cemetery at night. Cremate her, Rachel's conscience had told her. Bury your friend honorably. Who was it in the Bible who had come to dress the wounds of the Savior after his death? Mary and several other women with spices and things. It was done only for ceremony, but Rachel could see where such an act would be a comfort to the women who wanted to do something besides cry a lot. Rachel was no different than they had been. She decided to do this cremation for herself as much as for Charlotte. And why not? Why not say goodbye properly? Why wonder for the rest of her life if Charlotte had woken up from the dream in the coffin? Why torment her mind until Christ came over whether or not there were any scratches or claw marks in the silken lining of that casket? If there were such scratches, then Rachel had let Charlotte down. She had broken her sacred promise, sealed with a kiss on Charlotte's small, trembling lips. What sort of a monster would that make Rachel? One like Thaddeus Bremer. Up until now she had convinced herself that this was the thing to do. Now standing over the small grave that read, Charlotte Dance, she did not feel very much in control of herself. Now she wondered. The grave looked so very permanent beneath her feet. So very final, needing nothing but to be left alone. She almost just wanted to pay her respects and leave her down there. But she couldn't. Here was her chance to prove that nothing in this whole wide world would ever keep her from Charlotte. She had told her that nothing would ever separate them. Was that now a lie? Was that not as binding after death? Or was it the cop-out of the marriage vow, that till death do us part? Death could release you from a marriage. Well, she wasn't married to Charlotte. She had never signed a love contract with her, and she wasn't seeking to break one now. Was she? Did a mother's love extend just to the point of death? Rachel's love for Charlotte was a bond of choice, like the marriage bond. But unlike the marriage bond, it did not have to end in death. How long she had stood there, staring down at the task before her, she did not know. All she knew was night had fallen before she finally got started. She placed her small picnic bench nearby and 20 colored logs underneath the bench. She had all of her supplies ready to go. All she needed to do was dig up the casket and place the body on the picnic bench. Then she would put the gray and black robe over the body and tie the bird mask over the small, cold face. After that, she could start pouring the gasoline. She would dig a small fire break all around the body to ensure the fire did not get out of hand. The trees were far enough away so they would not catch fire. The trees were also dense enough not to let the old Welsh road passer-by see a small fire burning behind the timber line. A more perfect place to do this was not to be had anywhere in Peaceful Valley. This was the place. According to Roger, she'd burn about an hour at a goodly flame. Then the flames would die down, and the stench of burning hair and meat would be a great deal less. A good wind was beginning to pick up, blowing towards the southeast. A better wind could not have been found either. The smell and the flame tips would all be driven away from her, down the hill, towards the miles and miles of endless countryside. If they'd embalmed her body, she'd burn even quicker, and with less of an odor. Embalming fluid burns nicely, whereas congealed blood and viscera tends to slow down the process and retard the flames, creating an oily smoke that does not go away easily. She stuck the shovel in the ground, right in the place that she had clawed with her fingernails. That place was full of dead leaves now. The small depression was also quite wet from where it had recently rained. Her shovel, Roger's old gardening thing, was a fine tool to dig with. She was down to about 2 feet all the way across in less than 10 minutes. The loosely packed dirt made the going easier, and even a little bit faster than Rachel liked. She was still trying to psych herself up to open the box below. She did remember digging. It had taken her a long time to get very deep, after the initial 3 feet start she had gained. The dirt down at the 4-foot mark was packed in tighter and required much more to lift each shovelful. Her arms had begun to ache. She felt she might not reach the box at all. She contemplated maybe coming back tomorrow night. She contemplated a lot of things, including just giving up entirely. But she didn't. At 4 feet 5 inches, she struck something. She had to be careful now. The walls of her digging began to crumble around the 2-foot level, threatening to cave in on her deepest work. The thing she had struck was not yet visible to her. She only knew that if she could get the rest of this dirt out, she could tell what it was. This part of the dig had been the worst of all, she had remembered, the cleaning out of all that extra dirt. She continued to rest a lot, and to be amazed at how the dirt she was digging out of the ground seemed to be replacing itself as fast as she could dig it out. The situation was becoming hopeless. She wished several times that she had not done this at all. Dirt lay everywhere around the mouth of the grave above her. What had started out to be a very neat mound of dirt was now just a scattering of soil all over the surface of the ground. She was throwing lighter and lighter spades full up and out, everywhere. She would not have enough dirt left to cover this hole up again when she was finished. Well, screw that. She really didn't care at this point. Her arms were killing her in places like her shoulders and wrists. She was not used to digging ditches, and she knew she'd have hell to pay over this digging in the form of soreness later on. At 32 years of age, she was not the young party animal anymore. She knew better than to push herself like this. She sat down once and saw that she had better than a half-hour's work to go just to finish clearing off the roof of the crypt. If it was a crypt. It was certainly something down here, something big and concrete. She got out of the hole for a few minutes. She walked over to her car and got out a small vial of soreness cream, the good stuff from the hospital. It was full of a deep heating agent that would allow her to work on for a while and pay an even greater price later on. She slipped her jacket off and sat down in the front seat of the Mustang. She had placed a plastic bag over the seat to prevent her grinding dirt into her upholstery, and she squirmed into the cold plastic, tail first. It felt good to sit down again. How in the hell was she going to get Charlotte's body out of that hole if she couldn't even get to it? She wanted to cry. "No," said Rajalacher within her. "You were once married to a Navajo brave. You will not shame him like this. You cannot." She thought of this as she cut the heater on high and slipped all of her shirts off, one at a painful time. She sat, her bare breasts swinging freely. She started rubbing the fire cream into her arms and shoulders. Oh, that felt good. The cold, windy force was picking up, and all of her layers of clothing were soaked in sweat now. She sat back nude from the waist up and cried. She cried a long time as the burning in her arms slowly drove out the soreness and made her feel better. A lot better. She lay back against the seat and tried to think. If she could get the dirt off of that crypt lid and somehow manage to swing this 8-pound sledgehammer against the concrete top, she would be inside the tomb. Then if she could get the lid off and the crypt far enough back to allow her to see into the grave, she would be looking at what should be a casket. Lots of luck. If the casket was locked, she'd have to break the seal with her trusty crowbar. Now, if she got the casket pried up and opened without killing herself, she'd see Charlotte's body. Now her mind continued as her right hand aimlessly fondled her left nipple, erect from the cold and the heating rub. If she could get to the body, she could tie the great 3-stranded rope around Charlotte's feet. A good-sized slip knot around the trailer hitch on the back of the car would secure things nicely. That old silver knob that Roger had back there to pull his motorcycles had been in her way for years. She'd gotten a good-sized bruise on her shins every time she forgot the thing was back there and would walk aimlessly around the car. Now the piece was going to help her out. If she could somehow manage to get all of this done, she'd place the black tarp on the foot end of the grave so as to drag Charlotte out feet first. It would be rather brutal, but she was dead and wouldn't feel a thing. Just try not to look as you do it, she thought. Try not to see Charlotte fly out of her grave upside down, flapping her stiff arms like a wind-up angel. She closed her own eyes. The car was silent around her. Nothing mocked the madness she was about to do. Nothing came up to her car to stop her from continuing her quest for the remains of Charlotte Dance. Nothing bothered her at all except the slowly dying ache in her arms. Carefully she put on her shirts one at a time. She only wore 3 this time, and no jacket. It would be warm working in the grave, even with the cool winds coming through the trees. The heating rub had thawed her out nicely. It was, in fact, getting hot in the car right now. She cut her engine off, the heater winding down with the ignition. Getting out of her car again, she managed to find and pick up her shovel. Slowly and most carefully, she climbed back down into the grave to start digging once more. She had dug another 15 minutes, cleaning off the crypt lid fairly well, when she got a terrific surprise. One that not only made her jump for joy, but jump very quickly out of the way. Chapter 16. What the hell? That was her first and only thought as she heard the noise deep within the grave. It had scared the shit out of her. She didn't know what it was that had her. A coldness spiked into her chest like a heart puncture. She was aware that something was moving under her feet. It was not only moving, it was moving in opposite directions. She felt one of her feet sliding to the right and the other to the left. It was like standing over a great set of jaws that were suddenly opening up. That was the way she remembered it. What she didn't remember was tripping on the step mechanism that had the door secured to the top of the crypt. She had kicked against it, and the door had been released to open. She had gotten out of the grave just as the 2 doors opened and mired deeply into the dirt walls on either side of her grave. They were strong doors. Her cleaning of the crypt lid had left quite a bit of dirt for the doors to move, but they had crunched it back easily. A shudder went through her as she thought about what if she'd gotten a foot caught between one of those doors and the grave wall. Neither would have been very forgiving. She had taken her flashlight out of her back pocket and shined it down at the inside of the crypt. Motors were humming now, and she was afraid to get too close to the grave. It was alive, and she didn't know yet what all it might do. She regarded the sides of the grave, terrific bulges in the undug grass on either side. That was how much dirt the doors had slammed against the grave sides. The crypt had been forced into the grave walls with such a force that the ground had bucked up, like twin volcanoes about to erupt. A tremendous force. She stared at the hole for a long time. Down in the hole, a series of noises coming from the oblong box told her that a mechanical reaction had been started. She stood staring down at all that wonderful machinery connected to a coffin in the ground. What was all that doing down there? I'm dreaming, she thought. I'll roll over in a minute and I'll have to pee something fierce. It'll be 7 in the morning and I'll have dreamed every bit of this. What a crock. The noises intensified, startling her again. She realized that there would be no waking from this. This was somehow real. She had started something that she could not stop. Her eyes were so wide they began to ache and dry out on her. She had to remember to blink once in a while. And then came a low, droning buzz from the bowels of the earth. The buzz was so loud it vibrated her teeth. She felt the inner canals of her ears tingling with the intense vibration. Her feet were vibrating through the ground. It tickled her soles through her sneakers. She was getting nauseated. The buzzing got even louder. She ran over and got in her car, slamming the door shut. In the car, the buzzing was subdued, but she could still hear it. She shuddered. This was like a transformer when it gets knocked over, that bright blue bath of evil electricity, that awful sight that jolts out of the circuitry, blowing power all over town. She had seen that once before, and this was very much like that. She hated to see that sort of thing. It hurt her feelings. It didn't agree with her electrical wiring in her own body. The noise was ungodly. It was making her physically sick. This sound was the same sound that it took to make her sick, and the same nausea was coming over her. She sat staring through her windshield, trying to decide what to do. The buzzing did not seem like it was going to go away any time soon. If anything, it was getting louder. "This has got to cease," she said seriously, "or I'm going to go mad." She looked out her side window over to the grave, and she gasped. She turned her head so hard she strained her neck. She saw what appeared to be green light coming from inside the grave. Steven Spielberg. It looked like the resurrection of the second coming. Forcing herself, she opened the car door. The buzz was damn near intolerable now, but she managed to get out of the car and shut it behind her. She held her ears with the tip of each index finger tightly in her ear canals as she squinted towards the greenish glow coming from the ground. It was not a very intense light, nothing like that god-awful sound. But then it happened. Rachel had seen so many movies where this sort of thing happened that she felt obliged to stand and stare, to watch it as it unfolded. Something very cocoon was about to happen, she reasoned. Something very sweet and wonderful. So why was she peeing in her jeans? In truth, she was just too scared to move. The coffin or casket or whatever it was had risen up out of the grave. The buzzing was the sound it made as it rose, powered by some ungodly engine. She stared at the thing. She could not move because she could not take her eyes off of it. What had Brimmer done this time? The faintest thrill went through her. She looked and double-checked the tombstone behind the raised casket. It still read Charlotte Dance. She had, in fact, gotten the right one. Could it possibly be that Charlotte was still alive in this thing? Oh, sweet Jesus, would that be possible? When she could move again, she walked closer to the oblong box, to the casket-looking thing. It was built like a spaceship, with a bloated design, like it was overinflated. It had wires and pneumatic hoses and tubes all over it, going in and out of the lid, and wrapping back around under the box, like the exhaust pipes on a 39 Packard. She remembered leaning close and seeing the inside of it. It had a small blister-like window on either side, made of some thick glass, like a submarine might have. The thing was still buzzing, but one of its motors might have gotten hung up somehow. It was faintly grinding away, like a vibrator whose batteries were about shot. It had that same faint, useless bizzing sound to it. She was glad it was about dead. She didn't want any of those vibrations ever again. The green glowing lights were self-explanatory. They were a set of dashboard green numbers in a row of small screens. These were lined along the roof of the casket. She gasped a little as she realized what the numbers meant. One set was swiftly going backwards from 100,000. She watched as 7654321 went whizzing past her eyes. It wouldn't take too long to count back to zero at that rate. Another set of lights proclaimed a steadily rising temperature. Still another was showing her how the pressure was equalizing. Pressure? Temperature? Cryogenic deep sleep. That bastard Bremer had put Charlotte to sleep in one of his time capsules. Rage went through her, blind rage and panic. Poor Charlotte. She really had been buried alive, hadn't she? She really had dreamed a déjà vu dream. Rachel closed her eyes and concentrated. What had Bremer said about these cryox chambers? He had talked about them until everyone at work was sick to death of hearing about them. But at that time, they weren't working. They were still wet dream fantasies in his twisted little head. They weren't something that he was going to kidnap her daughter and put her in, to see if she'd die or not. They weren't something that they had to fear when he was talking about them. This was way different. The green lights flickered and brightened. She stared at the thing. The machinery began to hiss like a pissed-off house cat. She jumped, looking subconsciously for claws. There weren't any. The machine began to blow a cold mist out of small exhaust ports on either side. The mist was cold, colder than dry ice, sublimating off a large chunk. The lid began to rise off the casket. The strangest thoughts went through her mind. One of them was of a pyrotechnic vampire with glowing green teeth, rising up to suck her infrared soul. Another one was of the zombie Charlotte she had dreamed about. I wish my daughter back in the grave. The lid stopped. It hadn't risen off the casket at all. It had only seemed to rise up when the pneumatic hoses had gone flat. The counter numbers read 599992 at that precise moment, spinning backwards even faster than before. She went to the head of the casket to peek in the window. The blister had a silvery sheen to it, a reflective sort of substance. She could not see through it too well. It was like that one-way glass they use in stores. She had an idea. She shined her light over on the other side of the casket. This way she could see the beam of light shining through this window. Through the casket window on the other side, she could see perfectly. It lit up the interior enough for Rachel to make out the small flat forehead and the tiny upturned nose of her little Charlotte. There was no mistake. This was as advertised above in granite. This was Charlotte Dance. She had screamed anyway. How was she going to get Charlotte out of this thing? What had he done to her? What had she done by digging her up? Could she still be saved? I'm crazy, she thought. I have totally lost my shit, and I'm just waiting for them to come and box me up and take me away, where I can explain to them all about the resurrection of my Dayglow daughter and her light bright gravesite out in the Peaceful Valley Cemetery. Even then she'd realized the problem she was going to have trying to explain to anyone how and why she had gotten Charlotte out of the grave to begin with. They'd still say Rachel was crazy. Even if Charlotte lived through all this, they'd still probably want to lock Rachel up as a danger to the general public. Bottom line, people would fear her for what she had done. They'd be right to fear her. It was crazy what she did. It was not decent. Who would honorably rob a grave? Rachel had done one of those things you weren't supposed to ever admit to a living soul you had done. She felt like an outcast. Now, Rachel placed Charlotte back on the pillow and stood up from the bed to stretch her stiffened muscles. Okay, Rachel was a common ghoul for what she had done. She was a grave-robbing body snatcher, guilty of desecrating a public grave. But Rachel didn't care. Charlotte was probably going to last about a week in these conditions, but there was not any worldly hospital who could do her any better than Rachel. The only man in the world who might help her any more was the one who had put her in the ground to start with. That wasn't any good. Rachel recalled now how she had gotten poor little Charlotte's body out of the casket at last. The casket had a lever on the side of it. The lever went only one way, and when it was pulled towards its intended destination, It didn't go back the way it had come. There were a set of lock teeth on it, a child-proof cap for a casket. How thoughtful of Lord Brimmer to equip it with such a thing. What did Brimmer figure? That one of these caskets would get left on a trash pile at some county dump, and a group of children would come by and lock themselves in it, like one of those ancient refrigerators with the doors left on them? She had pulled the lever. Nothing happened, though, until the timer read triple zeros all the way across. At that time, the lid went hissingly up all at once. It was like Dracula in a really big hurry. The lid just flew straight up and opened, almost knocking her down. Mist and smoke flew everywhere. The pressure had been so great that the casket lid from the inside had warped like a beer can under the strain. It was puckered like cellulitic flesh under there. But there was no torn and shredded silken liner. Charlotte had never been conscious in this thing, anyway. What was in there was a very cold and very familiar, sweet little face. Sleeping Beauty out here in her forest primeval, with her knight in shining, sweaty skin standing over her. And how did it go in the fairy tale? Of course. As the tears fell down Rachel's face, she bent over the still, sleeping form and kissed her on her little lips very gently. Charlotte was cold and stiff as a board. Rachel looked at her chest. It was moving up and down very slowly, like it might stop at any moment. The machine under the casket gave out a loud, vibrating sound and shut off. Charlotte was a mess at this point. Her little gown was wet from the IV liquids that Rachel guessed to be some form of adrenaline. This must be some strange part of the resurrection process, Rachel deduced. Something else in the casket had been used to electrocute her frozen little heart back to life. In fact, if Rachel had been allowed to open the lid before the 000 timer had gone to 0, she'd have been fried where she stood. The electrical current passing through the outer lid had been enough to kill a brontosaurus. Now, even though Charlotte was breathing, she still wasn't finished. She was in an obvious coma, a coma induced by unnecessary medical witchcraft. She wanted more than ever to kill Thaddeus Brimmer. Coma. That meant a lot of work around the clock. That meant a nurse who was dedicated to this one patient. Rachel had just taken charge of patient Dance. Would she be able to meet that obligation? She was certainly going to try. Rachel recalled how she had placed Charlotte carefully into the folded rear seat of the Equus, carefully pillowing her head. She recalled how she had taken her home to the Abbey, still and lifeless. Janice had looked at her awfully funny an hour later when she'd made her trip down to the T-Mall for supplies. Rachel had dropped nearly $100 on one visit. And the things she was buying, Janice just had to ask her about them when Rachel finally approached the cash register checkout. "Rachel?" asked Janice. "Yeah," asked Rachel, her hair a mess, her sweaty body feeling like a limp rag. "I hate to ask, Rachel, but it's 2 a.m. now, and you're buying adult diapers." Rachel nodded like the little kid who had gotten caught with her hand in the cookie jar. "You're buying adult diapers, Rachel," repeated Janice, as if that would make her run back and place them on the shelf again. Rachel had no answer for her. At that moment, Janice looked down unconsciously between Rachel's legs. The pea stain was still there, as big as a bullseye target. Tears filled Janice's eyes as she tried to see how to ring the purchase up. Janice did not say any more about Rachel's purchases after that. After she had driven home again, she had hooked Charlotte up to the NG tubes and the IV fluids. She then packed all the supplies they would need to take with them. They couldn't stay here. Once Brimmer discovered that Charlotte's grave had been desecrated, the first place he'd look for was right here, across the street. That would never do. She didn't expect anyone to ever understand, so she didn't plan to ever explain anything. What if I'm hallucinating all this, she wondered. What if she really is dead? I thought I saw her breathing. I could have sworn that I took her out of a cryox casket instead of a real one. She looked over at Charlotte now. Charlotte lay quietly. Yeah, there was a breath just then, wasn't it? A slight rise in her chest. Rachel closed her eyes. She knew full well that if you stared at any corpse long enough, it looked like it was breathing. She wished that there was someone else in the world she could trust to look at Charlotte just for a minute. She wished with all her heart she could have an objective opinion. Some passerby who would say something like, "Yep, she's breathing. She's definitely still with us." She didn't trust her own mind any longer. She couldn't. It was biased. "What can your mind handle right now, Rachel?" she asked herself. "What can it tell you is real and what is not real? Are you able to understand that you dug Charlotte out of a simple grave, that you dragged her here to sit with her body because you really didn't have any intention of cremating her? You just wanted to see her again? Rachel, you weren't really going to set fire to your favorite bird mask, were you?" Rachel closed her eyes again. The room was quiet and the cold was getting bitter outside. She would doze for a while. She would doze, and then she would get up and open another can of nasogastric fluid. She would pour this down Charlotte's throat like Drano. She tried to keep the correct hospital attitude through all of this, even changing Charlotte's diapers. She was soiling them, by the way. She recalled Misery, an ancient novel by Stephen King. Nurses do go crazy, don't they? Of course they do. And they're so damned elegant about it. They have all the props and knowledge to totally immerse themselves in a world of medical make-believe. She began to shake uncontrollably. The only thing that kept her sane right now was the intense knowledge that if she really did lose it, Charlotte would die for real. And that had such a sobering effect on Rachel. Well, she reasoned, if Charlotte is lying here as a corpse, then she's not hurting. If she's not alive any longer, there's no problem for her. But if she is still alive, then I owe it to her and to myself to bring her back to life. I must not fail her. I will not. I swear it by all that is holy. Frangi knew where Rachel was. It was killing him inside, but he did know. Rachel probably didn't remember telling him. About the beach house. She had been very drunk at the time. Very loud party at Frangi's brother's place in the village. All sorts of strange things come into that party. Like a lot of parties in the village, the early evening crowd was a tame variety, and then as night approached, the weirdos began to crawl out of the woodwork. The leather boys and their slaves. The road warriors and the old bags they allowed to mother and make over them. The punks and the freaks. Frangi's brother was normal, but he loved the bazaar set. He was totally fascinated with them. He always threw Greenwich Village parties every Friday night after work. Rachel had come in with Donnie and Frangi during the sane time, but she had gotten too much to drink too quick, and she begged Frangi to stay until the boys came by. She did not know what she was asking. Frangi was terrified of the leather boys. They were all into pain and brutality. He was just into Donnie, thank you very much. He didn't care for all those whips and chains and dog-collared hoods without any eye holes. But for Rachel, he would stay, this once. If the local leather queens got out of hand, they would quickly leave. The subway cellar was just outside Tommy's door, and from there it was 3 minutes to the city limits and the parking garage where Donnie's club cab pickup truck had been parked. At that time in his life, Donnie wasn't afraid of anything. Big as a horse, he had been such a good-looking man before the AIDS virus. He still had that burnt-looking Daytona Beach tan about him, and he still had that set of nice round muscles. He was still the Adonis, and he did like to fight. That was why Frangi had decided to stay and let the tipsy Miss Blackwelder see just how bad a bunch of queers could really get. She had loved it. That night Rachel had gotten on famously with a 350-pound biker named Zeus. He had brought 3 of his slaves with him, 2 girls and a boy. They all had matching collars and everything. It was nauseating. Later, after the mass had exited to polish off the night at the Missing Link Bar and Grill down the street, she had come over and sat beside Frangi on Tommy's couch to put her head on his shoulder and to thank him for staying and showing her a wonderful time. That was when Rachel had told him about her father in the old beach house. It was somewhere off the coast of Massachusetts. He even knew the street address. It was 15 Sand Dune Way, and it was out in the middle of nowhere. It was still standing, she had bragged to him, through her 80-proof breath and her glassed-out eyes. It was just waiting for her to come back and set up house. Since Roger had died, she really didn't talk about her Abbey in the same excited tones anymore. She just sort of lived there. Frangie knew that Rachel could have moved to the beach house had Charlotte not come along when she did. It was one of the reasons why Frangie loved Charlotte so much. Charlotte had kept Rachel living in Peaceful Valley. Charlotte had come along at the right time to do that, and Rachel had regrouped herself into a woman again, into a mother image. She no longer wanted to be wild or smoke marijuana or meet that bunch of reptiles Tommy encouraged each week. She was actually productive again, and she was going to make it. Going to be all right. Now the worst-case scenario would find Rachel in that old beach house, brooding over the corpse of Charlotte Dance. Now he would have to brave the smell and wade in and get her, bring her outside. Then they'd bury little Charlotte in the ground near the beach house. Didn't Rachel say there was a small cemetery of ancient tombstones nearby, from some colony that didn't take or something? One more recent body wouldn't hurt. Charlotte had as much right to an historical burial as any of those people from England. She was, after all, born here in this country. They had been the ones without passports and visas. He decided that he would try to get her away from the corpse first, away from Charlotte. Then he would have the best chance of convincing Rachel that she was dead. It was a very long shot, but he felt like it would be worth it. "Have you forgiven Rachel for her deviant crime, Francis?" he asked himself. "If you are to bring her back to sanity, then you must not be afraid of her. If you fear her, she won't listen to you. You must be prepared to be rejected, even hurt. She might try to kill you. You will be the equivalent of reality, and she has already killed reality in her mind. She might not even realize what she's doing. Her internal mind is protecting her from a truth she cannot yet accept, the truth of Charlotte Dance being dead. Her mind will see you as the enemy, as a thing trying to kill Rachel. It might tell her to kill you." Frangie's head was hurting him. He sat there rubbing his temples with his fingertips. He was in actual physical pain. His eyes were sore in his head. He sat there a long time, trying to decide what to do. He did know where Rachel was, and that was right now the only thing he was sure about. Dr. Brimmer was drunk. He lay naked on his bed. Damn Rachel. Why did she have to go screwing around in the graveyard? Since word of her ghoulish act had spread, none of his men could get bodies into the cemetery any longer. He had 3 new cryox tombs waiting to go, and nowhere to plant them. Rachel had the devil's own luck about her, she really did. First to have found the grave, and then to have dug it up in such a way as to have kicked off the hydraulics inside the crypt. He had actually cried for Charlotte, for her life. There was no way Charlotte could survive the shock resurrection Rachel had forced upon her. She might have drawn all of 3 breaths. A brutal procedure on so delicate a system would kill her. Simply put, Charlotte was murdered by Rachel out of ignorance. If Rachel had come to him, he would have brought Charlotte back personally. He, of course, would have done so. That way he could have been a savior in Rachel's eyes. But this was his own stupidity, in a way. Putting the name Charlotte Dance on the damn stone, he could have put 1,000 other names on there. He just didn't think it was necessary. He didn't think. He closed his eyes. He remembered going to the gravesite on November 2nd to check the work his boys had done. He had been shocked to see the space-age casket lying open, rusting and emptied of its cargo. It had taken him a few minutes to plan countermeasures. Fake casket, a few other things, so he could report it later. Yes, he had decided to fix Rachel good for screwing things up. He had set up a real Halloween tragedy for the press. Then he had called them. Classic case of necrophilia. Lesbian lover digs up mate. A really cold fish. What a plot. A plot for Peaceful Valley. Brimmer never did discover what the picnic bench was for, nor the robe he found alongside the lovely bird's mask. If the gasoline had been left there, he might have figured it out. Brimmer had, of course, cleaned the area long before he made his infamous call of November the 8th. It had taken several men several days to get the machinery out of the ground and replace the cryox stuff with conventional graveyard paraphernalia. By that time he had decided to keep the mask and the robe as well. They were top-quality items, even if they had been rained on and ill-treated. On November the 8th, Bremer made an anonymous concerned citizen phone call to the press. He reported a grave desecration in the Peaceful Valley Cemetery. He'd made the phone call out of anger, the very same anger that drove Uncle Rory to try and nuke the hillside home of that damned witch. Rachel was a woman of potent powers over any man at all. Rachel was an obsession all her own. He leaned back on his pillows and licked his wounds with another gulp of 12-year-old scotch. His plan to discredit Rachel had backfired. Now he would just have to wait until the heat got out of Peaceful Valley long enough for him to cryox more seeds into the waiting earth. He did have leads on some other cemeteries, some historical grave sites in Williamsburg and Appomattox, Virginia. He could bribe the assistance of the people in charge. After all, not everyone thought his idea of cryogenic oxygenation was so macabre. There were some people in the world who thought as he did, that life should not be allowed to end, that age and entropy should be stopped, that aging itself was a disease. Cryogenic burial is not macabre, he told himself. Aging and death are the macabre things. The really scary things in life are death and pain. Old age. Old age is full of death and pain. Besides, any physical development that does away with the wonders of sex and pleasure, such as aging, is a death long before the air leaves the body. Maybe it was his desire to defeat death that had led him to mock it with the cryox caskets and the premature burials. Or maybe it was a show of submission. Imitation being the sincerest form of flattery, art imitating life, or in this case, death. Maybe. Or maybe he was just trying to stay busy and not think about it too much. That was closer to the truth than he knew. Chapter 17. 6 weeks had passed. When Rachel would sit on the porch at night, she would remember her very first night in the beach house here. She would recall how Charlotte had lain so very still, so very cold in her arms. But she would always remember the sweet, lively little girl who wanted to sit up on her bed and watch those old movies with her in the Abbey. Those had been some really sweet times. Rachel was almost ready to go back to the Abbey again to live. Almost. It would be a heart-rending time for her. She hadn't heard from Rajalacher in a long time. No more ghosts. No more memories that live and talk and remember better than she ever could. Perhaps the Abbey would make all things better. After all, a little hitchhiker named Charlotte Dance had come to live with her there. A wonderful husband named Roger had built it for her, and she still had a wonderful friend named Frangie. Frangie. Dear, sweet Frangie. Frangie had come through for her, after all. He had remembered the address of this place. Frangie's bravery to approach her like he had done had taken real balls. Rachel didn't feel crazy anymore. She just hadn't left the beach house yet. She was free to go home if she wanted to. No one was looking for her to arrest her. No one wanted to lock her up. Bremer had only been a voice on the phone, an anonymous concerned citizen who had cornered the DA on the steps of his office, the man not even knowing who Bremer was. But the DA's hands were tied. There was no grave for Charlotte Dance on file with the county. Sorry, Bremer, no crime. Of course, Rachel's anonymous letter to the DA had also met with a blank wall. They weren't about to go digging up graves just to see if they had frozen bodies in them. They didn't care. They had no evidence, and the only way a grave could be exhumed would be through a family member who wanted it done. Donnie had passed away. He died in his sleep at County General. Frangie was still living off 276 by himself. He was always begging her to come back to the Abbey again, to live. She had come back a couple of times for this or that, but she was never able to stay for too long. She liked the beach house. She had installed lights and running water because she wanted to make it right. This had been her father's favorite escape. The hospital had retired her with full pay. She had celebrated with her attorney at a late-night dinner in Philadelphia. The bill was over $200, but he had refused to let her pick up the check. Rachel cried a lot lately, but she had hated herself for it. There was no real reason for it. Things were going to get real good again for her. She just knew it. She really believed that they would. She got up and walked off the porch. She walked out to a small grave near the old Puritan burial ground. The stone she would reach out and touch, like it was the actual person. It was, in a way. She stood there and cried selfishly for herself. She was all right. She just had a few tears to get rid of. A few tears to drain so she could go on with her chores. Chores she had wanted to do, and duties she would fight for the honor of performing. A small figure stood beside her. As she ran her hand over the gravestone of Angus A. McPherson, she heard a voice. "Rachel?" asked the small, reed-like voice. Rachel turned to look at her. The girl beside Rachel was trembling. Her eyes were great blackened circles of stain brought on by the deep compression of cryogenic deep sleep. Her face was ghastly white. All of her pigment had been bleached out of her during the perverse resurrection. Her skin had a translucence to it, like a clear layer over the girl's face, her still beautiful face. The girl was well scrubbed and cleaned. Rachel bathed her every day. She always shampooed her long, beautiful ponytail, and she always stroked it 100 strokes, just like Charlotte used to do for herself. Charlotte was extremely damaged. Charlotte was the one true example of a love from beyond the grave, a love that never would really die. Charlotte was her baby still, and Rachel kissed and held her often, just to stop the child from shaking so badly. Her nervous system was shot. Charlotte stood now, holding her arms out to Rachel like an infant might do, the stance that said, "Take the baby." Rachel unwrapped her long afghan from her own shoulders and wrapped it around Charlotte's frail ones. She lost Charlotte deep in the quilted browns and yellows and whites of the afghan. Charlotte surfaced and smiled at her, wrinkling her nose up childishly. "Am I all better yet, Rachel?" asked Charlotte, looking at Rachel seriously. The kid could read minds if she couldn't do much else. "Yes," said Rachel, wiping the hair back out of her eyes. "You're a lot better now, don't you think?" The little girl shivered. "I'm cold, Rachel," said Charlotte, blinking. "Let's go back inside," whispered Rachel into her cold little ear. "I'll make you some soup. You want some soup?" Charlotte's eyes widened, and she shook her head vigorously. Yes, she did want some soup. They had started back towards the house when Charlotte stopped again. Her eyes were staring straight into the ground. Rachel knew this was her way of trying to concentrate, to form thoughts before she spoke. It was a promising sign of her recovery when she did that. She looked up at Rachel again seriously. "Oo know something, Rachel?" asked Charlotte, licking her thick lower lip. "What's that, darling?" asked Rachel. "Ah," she said, pleased to hear how it came out. Rachel clapped her hand over her own mouth when she heard her say it right. Her eyes were bright again with even more tears. "Ah," said Charlotte proudly. "Want to be just like you." Rachel grabbed her in an embrace, sobbing into her hair. She kissed her forehead like she always did. She was laughing and sobbing at the same time. "You are," she whispered into the little girl's ear. "You are going to be just like me. I promise that, Charlotte." And Rachel swore that same oath she always swore deep in her mind, the one oath she had left in the world. Whatever happened to Charlotte, Rachel was always going to be there for her. Whatever else happened, Rachel still had her baby girl. And that was all she needed. The end.